going over mesh networks and deformers to make awesome UI. We're going to be going over the armor UI that I created and the topographic map. The armor UI will be first. I used a mesh network and bend deformers for the halos. Alright guys, so I went and just brought in my torso mesh so I have something for the mesh network to distribute over, but first we're going to start with the halos. So the halos, I just had a cube and I made it into a rectangle using the input box and the channels, and then I ended up creating more subdivisions in it. This is important because you want the rectangle to curve when you add the bend deformer and not just be a jaggedy curved rectangle. So when you add the bend deformer, just go to deform, nonlinear, and then bend. And then from there you can just mess with the curvature. If you want, you can mess with the high bound, low bound. I don't usually mess with it, but if you wanted, like, say the bottom to be straight and then the top to be curved, then you would make the low bound 0 and the high bound higher up. So here I'm going to just scale the Z down because I want it to be a thin halo, just so it looks like almost 2D but not 2D, if you get what I'm saying. And then if you want to have the curve but not the bend tool, just go to select your object and delete the history on the object, and it will get rid of the bend tool but keep the curve. Alright, next I'm just going to end up aligning the pivot point to the middle of the curve so that when I end up animating it later, it can just spin in a circle, and then I will line it up underneath the torso. After that, I will create the other two, and I will meet you back when I do that. Right, so we got our halos done. I'm going to go ahead and group them together. Right now I'm just freezing the transformation so don't get all screwy with me later on when I'm animating. And I'm just going to go ahead and group them together and just name them. And usually I like to, because I'm going to end up putting them at the top as well, I duplicate the group and then I set up the pivot point to be just in the middle of my torso, and then I just spin it around. I end up deleting these and regrouping them and recopying them and duplicating them over, I think, about 2 more times, just because I like to have an idea where I want them to be first, but obviously when I make changes to the bottom ones, I can just duplicate them and have them at top. So alright, so next I'm just going to add the textures to the halos. Just going to add a blend material to specific faces that I want, because I want it to be like a green but with like a white intermissions between the green. So I'm just going to select specific parts of the halo, add a blend material to that, make it green, and then select the other faces that I didn't have selected and add a separate blend material to those. I use blend because my hardware works best with blend materials because of my hardware's limitations. So if you just want to make sure that there's no render issues later on, just use a blend material and you should be good to go. Alright, so let's go ahead and set up our mesh network. So I created a cube right there, and when you want to create your mesh network, you're going to want to just select your cube, make sure to name it obviously first, go to Mesh under Animation Mode, and go to Create Mesh Network. There, when you're creating a mesh distribute and you want to have color, make sure to do copy and not instance. So right here, I'm just going to do the mesh distribute, select your mesh, and then Control select your network, and then right click and choose connect on the input. Here I just mess around with how many cubes I want just by messing with how it scatters across the mesh object. I wanted a lot, so I did edge. And then you can scale all the cubes down by selecting the original cube and scaling it. And then when you use the color node, make sure you go to your repro node. But your repro node is only there if you use copy. So go to your repro node and do color per vertex. Make sure to check it. Next, I'm going to add the color node, and basically you can just add like a base color and then just mess with the hue and the saturation to create different combinations of colors. And then I will use the seed to change where I want the colors to be on the object. Next, I will add the signal node, which is pretty cool. If you want it to loop, which you do want it to if you're doing this project, you're going to want to change 40 noise to looping so that it actually loops when you're messing with it and when you do the timeline. So when you do that, you want to go to your noise setup and change the loop frames and the timing to however many frames you have, basically. So right there I just changed it, and it should loop twice at least, because I have 120 frames through the entire animation. But basically what I'm doing here is I'm just having the cubes move about a little bit and also scale, just to add like some variety in there, so it kind of looks like the network itself is like organic almost, but like in a very sci-fi organic kind of way. Alright, now I just want my network to rotate. And in order to do that, you want to select your mesh, not your network, but your mesh, and rotate it and set your keyframes. When you do that, all the network and the cubes should rotate with the mesh. Just make sure to hide your mesh, obviously, if you don't want it to be seen. Alright, so I go in my graph network here. Usually I would do infinite and do cycle if I wanted to loop, but the problem with that is that when you do that, it's not going to end at exactly the amount of frames you want, because when infinite and cycle do a loop animation, it just puts the next sequence one frame forward. So let's say I had this at, what is it, like 30 frames or whatever. Instead of ending at 120, it would end up ending at like 123, which is not what I want. So I had to end up just copying and pasting where I want the frames to be and making sure that when I want it to change to the next loop or cycle, to grab the frame before and do stepped next for the tangents. Obviously you want to do the same thing for all of the halos as well. So when you have your frame set for the halos, copy and paste and make them step next. And you should have a pretty good smooth animation of just them spinning. I like to offset them a little bit by making the small one faster and the big one slower, and then the middle one kind of average. Here I just copy and pasted the frames from the bottom halos to the top halos. That way they would be almost identical, it would just be flipped. Alright, so that should be all for the little armor UI I created. You can go ahead and check it out in the render view if you want to look at the colors, and just make sure that when you create something like this, I would suggest maybe using some of the awesome create polygons like a dodecahedron or a hexagon, but you can make some pretty cool stuff. So next we're going to be doing the map UI, basically a topographic map. I use duplicate special and wave deformers and create a moving light. So when you have whatever you're going to duplicate, just go to duplicate special, it's under edit, and choose copy, and do change offsets and number of copies to basically however far apart you want them and how many you want. You want to do the same thing for the rows, so group it and then duplicate special, change the X, switch out the X and Z to make a square, and then duplicate it. And then group that together as well. You can also scale by just grabbing one of the meshes you had to make everything smaller. I like to go ahead and freeze transformations and delete history so I don't forget it later on, because usually I do. So we're going to be adding our wave deformers to our network, or not network, but group, and then we're going to do the wave deformers. So deform linear wave, and usually you would just think of when you're using wave deformers as like a puddle is what usually you would think of when you're using wave deformers. But if you set it up correctly, you can pretty much just get like a mound or like a mountain if you want, and you can get some pretty cool ideas just based off of that. So here I just mess with the wavelength and the amplitude, as well as the offset and the drop off. Now when you're creating these, you can obviously see I am getting like a mountain-esque hill type. You can also scale it when you're done. Watch out when you're adding all these wave deformers. I only use 3 because by the third one my computer started freaking out. I don't know if it was just Maya was having trouble handling how much was going on with all the deformers. So just make sure that when you're creating these deformers on this topographic map, don't add too many, because it may not be able to handle it. You can see earlier when I was doing the wave deformers, it was like my mesh was like turning like green and like loading like in real time, so that was kind of weird. But that's what happened when Maya has a hard time understanding what's going on. So when you're adding these, if you want to end up like having them go through like different positions and stuff, just do that when it comes to the animation and just have them appear at a different position once they go through. Now here I'm going to start animating them, kind of getting an idea of what I want right here, and I like to just have it go through in a straight line. Obviously I'm doing like a fly in, so I want it to be straight, and so I don't want the mountains to move left and right basically. So when you start your animation, obviously set your first keyframes, but make sure they're not in the topographic map yet. Make sure they're just out of it, and then later on you can have them like move through it. And then when you have all your wave deformers going through, and they've already gone through once. Once you do that, you can set up a keyframe, I would say like maybe 5 frames after it goes through, like I did, and it will just move it to a different position than it was before at the start position. So you'll see later on when I do it, when it goes through, I set up a keyframe at 5 frames after that, and the big hill will be at a different spot than it was before, and so will the small and the medium hills. That way it just adds a little bit of variety to the animation, and it's not just the same hills and mountains over again. But when you do those, make sure to go into your graph editor later on and add step next to the end frame of the first cycle you have. Alright, here I'm just kind of messing with the lights. I wanted to have a little shine to it, so I created a green light, and basically I just wanted the light to show up, but here I'm just kind of messing with how it would appear with a glow, and obviously if you have a glow it's not going to appear correctly, so I kind of just said screw it to making the matte blue because I wanted the light to add that shimmer. But obviously when I added the light I couldn't really get it to not, you know, make it all green even if I did quadratic. So you can add a little bit in incandescence like I did there before, and it'll kind of keep the same color, but obviously the green is still gonna try to like filter out all the way. So don't have any problems with that. Here I'm just trying to get an idea of like maybe how I want the shimmers to appear. Maybe I want them to like go across at like a cross or not. No, like an X. But later on I end up changing how the point light animates. But this is basically how you would get the shimmers done. Alright, so let's go ahead and add our little surrounding square. So I'm just going to end up creating a cube. Right here. There we go. And then just going to make it large. Not too large, but you know, larger than the map itself. And then make it skinny. And then what I'll end up doing is giving it some subdivisions. And if you've never modeled before, I know this is an animation class and modeling, you know, you don't really have to know modeling in order to do this, but if you want something cool, I would suggest like how I do here, maybe like grabbing the all the faces on the bottom and the top, and you do like edges right there where I selected all the faces and then went to the side view and deselected the sides of it, or you could just, you know, select all the faces on the top and bottom. But what I did there was just extrude it. If you don't know how to extrude, it's just a G. I'm pretty sure G is the hotkey, but if you rather not use the hotkey, you can go into modeling toolkit over on the right side, and there should be an extrude button there. And then I just deleted some faces, and then selected the edges, the edge loops that had holes in them, obviously, because you don't want holes in your mesh. And then I did fill hole, which is under mesh at the top. Right. At this point, I just said screw it to the animating the light perfectly, and just went to my curves and surfaces and just added a circle curve, and I'm just going to attach it to the curve. So obviously, if you remember correctly, it was constrain under animation and do motion path. And now the light just circles throughout, and then go into your graph editor and make sure it's linear. And that's basically how I created the topographic map. It's not that complicated, but it looks pretty good when it's all said and done. Alright guys, so that's how you do the armor UI and the topographic map. Good luck on your UI, and I hope to see some pretty cool stuff in class.